Okay, so we've got major American cities on fire. We've got statues being torn down. We've got calls for defund the police. We've got violence rising in many major cities. What in the world is going on? Well, what's going on is Marxism. So let's talk about that today in our video. This is Pastor Matt here. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, a Reformed church just north of Pittsburgh. Come worship with us and check us out at some point. All right, let's talk about Marxism. You probably remember the name. If you've gone to university more recent, you probably studied Marxism quite thoroughly. If you went to university quite a while ago, maybe not so much. But Marxism is definitely in the air. And when I explain a little bit about who he is and what he believed, you're going to begin to see why we're seeing some of the trends that we're seeing nationally today. So first of all, Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, he's a German philosopher. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin, so he's not an idiot. He has studied under Hegel for one, and Darwin for another, Feuerbach for a third. Remember Darwin, of course, Origin of the Species. Feuerbach was this idea of man creates God in his own image instead of God creating man in his image. And then Hegel is the philosopher of history. Hegel has this idea of the dialectic. There's a thesis, there's an antithesis that comes into conflict with it, and then a new synthesis emerges. Well, Marx takes his philosophy in the direction of economics. And so the first thing that Marx says that's very important to understanding what he means is that man is essentially, in essence, a maker. Homo faber, man the manufacturer, instead of Homo sapien, man the knower. So Marx has this idea that we are what we do. And you've probably experienced this. You meet somebody, you say, hello, where are you from? What's your name? What do you do? Well, that's a Marxist idea that we're deeply identified with what we do. Now, Marx began to see some tension in the Industrial Revolution because a lot of the meaning of work is separated from the man himself. So whereas man used to have deep, meaningful work as a farmer, an artist, a philosopher, a writer, as the Industrial Revolution goes on, a man begins making widgets in a factory, widgets that he's never going to use. He makes 2,000 widgets a day. None of them benefit him. They all go to the company, which is making money hand over fist. He's seen almost none of it because he's working 12-hour days for very low wages. And so man, the maker, the modern worker, is estranged from his meaning, his purpose. He's alienated from his self, from his society, even from nature. And so Marx is deeply disturbed with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and even capitalism itself. Capitalism, of course, the idea of free enterprise, in which markets compete against each other, winners do well, losers do poorly. Marx sees all of that as heading in the wrong direction. He's seen monopolies take power. And so Marx begins to develop an idea that is central to understanding what's happening today. Now, you need to understand this about America today. And this is why Marxism is on the rise, unfortunately, in the United States. Marx sees all of history as a class warfare between the haves and the have-nots, between the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the proletariat on the other. Remember 1984, the proles, those were the lower class people who worked hard for nothing? Right, exactly. So in Marxism, there's always those who are in power and those who are not. There's the haves and the have-nots. To go back to the idea of feudalism, there's the nobles and there is the serfs. And so Marxism stirs a deep resentment from the have-nots on the sake of the haves. The proles are to loathe, despise, and deeply resent the bourgeoisie for what they have. And here's why. Because according to Marxism, whoever controls the means of production controls the game. Whoever has the power makes the laws, enforces the law, sets the ideas, sets the standard. If you own the monopoly game and all the pieces and the board, you get to say how the game is played. So Marxism fundamentally works from a position of resentment. If you are one of the haves and have-nots, then you should resent the haves. In fact, to be fully Marxist, you should work towards a revolution in which the means of production exchanges hands. And this is where Marxism gets a little bit dangerous. Marxism foments resentment and revolution, because it encourages and empowers what he sees as the lower class to rebel against the powers that be. If you have power of the means of production, then you have the power again in the game. And so why not foment that and make that happen? In fact, Marx, like the Hegelian that he is, sees these two conflicts coming into being with one another, the haves and the have-nots. These are going to be the thesis and the antithesis. And when these come into conflict, this revolution, Marx thinks, is going to produce something like a utopia, in which the proles, because they're benevolent and good, once they actually attain power, they're going to relinquish that power and finally be a benevolent dictatorship, which is going to result in communism or socialism or the sharing of all goods. So whereas capitalism encourages competition, industriousness, working hard, laboring to better oneself, one's family, and one's community, Marxism sees revolution as the primary way to bring about some sort of a utopian sharing of the goods. And Marx, as a great optimist, really feels that this system is going to work. Once the proles finally rebel against the bourgeoisie, they are going to then share everything. They're going to share power, they're going to share control, they're going to yield back authority, and society will be brought into some kind of a utopian state. So it's a lofty goal, but a deeply misguided goal in some ways. And one of the real dangers is when Marxism begins to intertwine itself with critical racial theory, critical gender theory, critical sexuality theory, because now the resentments are deeply ingrained in people's lives. That there's a class that's always trying to destroy you. It's the other people. It's the other people out there who have what you don't want to have. And if you want to be like them, then by all means, you should take it using the means of revolution if necessary, because that's the only way that the means of production are going to change hands. And so Marxist, when it's combined with intersectionality, can really take on kind of a dark and foreboding overall ambiance to it. It can be quite divisive, and that's why you're seeing so much division in our nation today. Political division, the haves versus the have-nots, gender division, economic strife, class warfare with one another. All these things are being fomented intentionally by those who are Marxists, because that's the way they think the utopia is going to be brought in. So that's deeply problematic. It is fundamentally a philosophy of resentment and revolution by all means necessary in order to exchange the means of production, which is another way of saying the power. All right, so there's a bunch of problems with Marxism. One of the ideas that is problematic is that all hierarchies are fundamentally oppressive, power-based hierarchies, which isn't necessarily true. Some hierarchies are competency-based hierarchies. So let me just ask you this. Think about the company that you work for, assuming that you have a job. Think about the person that's in the CEO position. Did they inherit that position because their grandfather had it, and his grandfather before him, and his grandfather before him? Well, maybe in some very rare instances, some companies may exchange leadership like that, but most of the time, in a capitalistic society, people rise to the top because of competency hierarchies, not necessarily oppressive hierarchies. Chances are that in your corporation today, the CEO or the COO is a highly educated person who's attained multiple degrees, has a fairly broad spectrum of personal gifts, including personality giftedness, leadership giftedness, intelligence giftedness, and is willing to work very, very hard hours. So chances are that person rose to the top because of competency, not necessarily because they inherited this. So the idea that all hierarchies are fundamentally oppressive, just simply not necessarily true. Another thing is that Marx is always talking about two classes, the haves and the have-nots. One of the things that he fundamentally misunderstands is the possibility of a very healthy middle class. In fact, if we were to do a distribution of wages, we might see that it's quite pear-shaped. Yes, there are a lot of people at the bottom with lower wages, but there's also quite a few people in the middle and then very few people at the top. But it's not necessarily a good versus evil thing, is it? No, there are good people in the bottom, good people in the middle, good people at the top, just as there are evil people at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. So the idea that one group is always malevolently oppressing, destroying, keeping down, keeping them under their boot is just fundamentally wrong. And not only that, but Marx's idea that when the proletariat finally rebels against the bourgeoisie and takes power, that they will be the benevolent ones to relinquish said power, well, that is just fundamentally misguided because it totally misunderstands the sinful nature of humanity. When have you ever seen it in history that when a revolution has taken place, the winners of the revolution benevolently yielded power back to the people? Doesn't happen. And so this is the real problem with Marxism, is that it has not, will not, and has never worked historically. And so you can tick them off. You can go through the USSR, right? Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Remember that before Russia? Yeah, they collapsed hard, didn't they? You have Maoist China, brutal regime. You've got Stalin, you've got Lenin, you've got North Korea, you've got Venezuela, you've got Cuba. Every single time Marxism has been tried in its socialist manifestations, it is an unqualified disaster financially. Even the most basic of resources eventually begin to be so scarce that you have to form breadlines. But not only that, but Marxism is usually attended by tens of thousands, if not millions, of dead bodies as the harsh, cruel oppressors, once they actually take over, don't yield back the power that they were that they were supposed to. So one of the things you have to understand is that in today's society, Marxism is very prevalent in the universities. It's taught as though it is the greatest idea. It is taught as though it is somehow a better, more benevolent, more merciful, financial superstructure than capitalism is. Now, capitalism has some problems too, but capitalism fundamentally encourages competition and hard work, whereas Marxism fundamentally encourages socialistic sharing of all things, communism. And by the way, why would you want to work hard if your neighbor over there, well, he works super hard and you both end up with the same amount of bread in your cupboards every day? Why would you work hard? Well, it totally de-incentivizes hard work. And so probably if I could put my finger on it, the real danger of Marxism is, as I've already said, it is fundamentally a philosophy of resentment. If your neighbor has something that you don't have, then what's stopping you from taking it? And that's exactly what we're seeing across the United States today. Well, I hope that was helpful. I realize that was a very superficial overview of Marxist philosophy, but perhaps it gives you just a little bit of understanding of why these movements of resentment, these identity politics, these intersectional theories are being floated everywhere. And we continue to hear about this two-class system of oppression and oppressor and the oppressed. And perhaps, I hope not, I really hope not, but perhaps we're on the verge of seeing yet another Marxist revolution. Hasn't worked out in history, and I don't have much hope that this would either. Thank you so much for checking in for my video today. Do love you lots, praying for better things, and we'll talk to you later.